for all of our students who don't know you, and for kind of our wider audience here too, can you just give us a little bit of background on kind of who you are and your journey into ministry?
Yeah. So, yeah, Mark says, been in Melbourne my whole life, lived in the same part of Melbourne my whole life. Um, my parents weren't in ministry. My father came to faith as a young adult, and so we grew up in a Christian family. But when I was 17, a friend visited our house who was from the US, and he had sort of a missions organization. And part of what they did was worked amongst sort of more poorer communities in the US. And he said, "Hey, do you want to spend your sort of summer in between the end of high school and going to college? So just serving." So I'd gotten into advertising, so I was going to study advertising, and had a very definite direction of my life, and thought, oh, this sounds like an interesting, fun adventure. Came across to the US and spent some time both in California, mainly Los Angeles and San Francisco, and yeah, so I had my first real encounter with doing ministry with sort of urban, I guess we call it impoverished area, we call it in Australia, and yeah, God really did a number on me. And, it wasn't like, oh, I've always wanted to go into ministry. It was just like this clear moment. I remember one of the sort of people there who were working in that area just had this chat to me, which was almost like an older brother. Hey, what's the direction of your life? There's this need in the world, and God sort of really took me apart, and just planted a heart for actually sort of ministry in my heart at that point. I came back, continued for college for a period, but then I felt actually the Lord asked me to leave, which is a big deal. And I then took up an internship with the Salvation Army and ended up working for the Salvation Army for 10 years in ministry. I know a lot of people in the US are not aware of the Salvation Army's sort of, I guess, church side, but it's a church denomination which calls itself a mission with, particularly a heart for the urban poor, which is done for over a century. And then for about 10 years, I ended up leaving and coming to the current church I'm with, which is Red Church. Just started on sort of the lower staff level, and slowly God just continued to work through me, and I took over as senior pastor in 2009. But just the book and writing thing, I never intended to do. I've always had an interest in culture, and just out of the blue, got asked to write on culture, not seeking it. And then God's used that sort of element of, I guess, a call to speak into culture, which has also just grown alongside the church stuff.
And has it sort of been that's kind of helped you refine a voice looking at culture into also, I mean, being somewhat of a futurist? I don't know if that's the word that you would use for it, but I've been deeply helped listening to your voice at that as I think about prepping the next generation. And borrowing from some Barna terminology for what does it mean to be resilient within this. So how does it go? How did you move from sort of looking at cultural settings to in many ways, sort of looking into the future and saying, this is where I think the church is
Mm,
going.
mm. It was really interesting. Like, whilst I didn't study advertising, the first part that I did was very much looking at culture. So I sort of had this training on how do you look at culture, understand cultural trends. Um, I found that advertising it's a lot less ideological. So they just at the end of the day want to reach people. Like ideologies, well, particularly then was less part of it, and so it was just like, how do you actually understand what's happening in culture? So weirdly, I then had that training and then came to church, and just still had that mindset. And I studied missiology as well at seminary, and so I think also bringing that sort of lens of how do you look at cultures outside of, I guess, the West, but then bringing that view back to the West. So I think that's also how it developed as well.
Okay. Now, in reading and talking about that, as I listen to your voice and sort of the way that you engage it, one of the things that's so appealing to me is in our current setting, I hear so much despair when people talk about the current state of the church, right? I'm seeing all these statistics coming in from American churches who think that's anywhere between 10 and 50% of people left their church, even just during this pandemic time, and wondering what it's going to look like on the other side of that. But when I listen to your voice, I hear a lot of hope. I hear a
Mm,
lot of positivity, and that this is a moment to be seized for opportunity, and that renewal might be
mm,
just right around the corner. So, Can you speak
Mm,
into that a little bit, and where does that come from, and how are you reading the
mm,
tea leaves to draw
mm.
those sorts of conclusions?
Yeah. Yeah, I think like, there was definitely a sense in the last few years of pessimism, particularly the church in the West. And, I understand that. I felt that myself a bit, to be honest. And I guess I looked in two directions. One, I began to look at what God has done through history, and then just talking to other Christians from around the world, how God is working in other places. And so the idea that God isn't working, hasn't worked, can't turn really dark circumstances around is actually just patently false, is what I learned as I read. There was actually a moment when I actually saw this little talk online by Nicky Gumbel, who's the vicar at HTB in London, and he just talked about in the 18th century how at one Easter service at St Paul's Cathedral, the huge cathedral in downtown London, there was like, it was something like 7 people turned up, and in my head I'm like, what? Like in my mind, I think back 200 years, everyone's going to church. And I began to look at that, and then just after that, then you had the Great Awakenings that happened, in the United States, in or North America, Caribbean, Britain, all around the world, really. And you realize that it's really dark before you have this breakthrough. And so I just began to look for that pattern, and I guess one way I've sort of codified that is, crisis precedes renewal, and the message for us at this moment, we're in crisis, and we're not just in a crisis, we're in multiple crises. The church is in crisis, the culture is in crisis, there's a pandemic, but then there's economic, political, geopolitical, personal, mental health. So many things are being like revealed at this moment. It's precisely those moments when God sort of turns up and does something new. And I think for me, it was also a switch in my thinking. I was always trying to like, how do I do church better? I always want to learn. You're always looking at what other churches are doing. And I think for me, as I read in history, it's actually the point where you got to the point where it's like, man, I don't know what to do anymore. Like I'm at the end of my working this out with my human brain. And I think it's at that moment when I looked at the lives of different, leaders, like men and women that God has used throughout history. It's that moment of desperation that I think then actually releases something in you, which makes you more of a channel to God, what He wants to do in the world at that time, and also makes you think creatively. So there's a sense where this pandemic has, totally disrupted us, but I think we needed to be disrupted. I have this sense there was a virus before the virus. The virus was that secularism was here, and we were just increasingly competing for a smaller group of people with increasingly sophisticated means, which I don't think was necessarily creating great disciples. We were able to gather people in a room. Were we transforming lives for Jesus? I didn't see heaps of evidence of that, to be honest, in the West. When I look at and compare it to, say, just for an example, like what's happening with the Persian church globally, um, there's been more converts in the Persian community in the last 10 years than the last 10 centuries. We have had Persian people come to our church, and seeing people who just wholeheartedly give their lives to Jesus. I've learned just from that one example of there's a disparity between what I see happening in communities around the world and what's happening in the West. So yeah, I see this as a real moment of opportunity. I think it's terrible. It's terrible what's happened in the world, the political instability. Every time I feel worried, I actually see that as an invitation to go, no, God is in control of history. He's moving history towards his ends. He's used the people of God before. And even a check, like what I realized is I think part of what's happening at this point in time is the West's safety and security, in that we actually had a hidden bias inside of us that the West, there's rules that happen in the West that shouldn't, that don't apply anywhere else. Like, why should we have this environment where everything's safe and easy all the time? Like, why? Where I hear the story of the Vietnamese pastor who's put in jail. Oh, that happens in Vietnam. But then here I go, no, well, the model of church we have is, well, we're going to put coffee on for you, and there's really easy parking. And we've got a really cool young adults pastor who's going to speak your language and make you comfortable. And I just think that partially, the culture of Christianity was the virus before the virus, and I think God is through this pandemic has, that's being disrupted.
It's good. I mean, and obviously a disruption that's deeply needed, but also one that's hard, I think, for us to receive. It feels like in the West, within the church, whenever that disruption comes, we turn around and I feel like the prosperity gospel that we've actually believed in becomes revealed for what it is, because there's a blaming back on God of where were you and what am I doing wrong? And I guess my question for you is, how did we get there? Like, how did we move from a theology of suffering and seeing God in these difficult places and seeing these great movements of God in periods of decline, only to turn that around and find the most fertile soil for renewal? All of a sudden, maybe it wasn't all of a sudden, but we became this church where we just expected that everything was going to keep moving up and to the right. And
Yes.
how did we get there, Mark?
Mm. I think there's a few things. I think one, you had this Western project where we believed history was going to slowly progress to this positive end, a utopia, and we're going to slowly slide there. So that's been in the West for some time. And part of that was there was also encoded in that an ideology that that would also happen as we push back on religion. That the less religious the West became, we'd move away from superstition and move towards this enlightenment. All of that was very religious language. That then put the church in this position where, it had to then respond, in a sense, to the culture in a new way. And part of, I think, what the church did as part of also that Enlightenment project was also radical individualism. And, radical individualism, particularly in, let's call it the New World, as it was called at the time, particularly in countries like Australia and North America, was also tied to pastors gone. You can just reinvent yourself. And this enabled this sense of this project of self reinvention. Now, that was not available to everyone, that was available to some people, and some people were left out of that. So we sort of ended up falling into this chaplain to society's individualism. And so, for those who wanted to keep going with their faith, we could have this element where, well, we can still give you Christianity. We can give you all the goodies and the prizes that contemporary society offers you, but with a Christian veneer. So here's how you can be successful. Here's how you can have an enjoyable life. Here's how you can have a hedonistic life. But we'll give you the Christian veneer over it. And there was always an end point to that. And I also think the sort of third part is that we lived, particularly since 1989, with the fall of communism. Before that, the world was caught in this great struggle, and there was a fear in people that there was a nuclear attack. I grew up as a boy reading. There was a book called When the Wind Blows, and it was this British children's book, and it is horrifying. Like, I think only the Brits could come up with it. And it's the story of an elderly couple in rural Sussex who lived through a nuclear winter. And it's a kid's book, and it's horrible. And they're like vomiting green stuff, and they die at the end. This would never fly in the US. It's not a happy ending. And I read that as a kid, but that was like the world could end at any moment. And that's gone. And then 1989, communism falls, and the message was the world's going to slide and progress to this wonderful place now. And so the myth was this bubble, and the myth was the economy is going to keep growing, individualism is going to keep expanding, and it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which down the bottom survival, up the top is self-actualization. We went right to the top. Life is about self-actualization. You can have the career, which gives you incredible meaningfulness. You can have this life where your friends pour into you like you've never had people pour into you before. You can live in this incredible, inner city, hipster, urban environment. You can have all of this stuff because society's putting in this protective bubble. It was a myth. There was no bubble, and the whole thing was falling apart. But that has deeply, deeply discipled people, that global thing, particularly in the West. So I think all of those combined, but the idol, I think, is having the carpet pulled out from under it at this point in time. Fascinating talking to a friend, and she's doing social research with Gen Z, or as you would call it, Gen Z. And she said that literally in the last 12 months, what you're seeing is Gen Z started the pandemic high up on their life goals were defined at the top of the self-actualization, Maslow's hierarchy. They've now come way down. So young people are no longer saying, oh, I want to have the best job and travel the world. They're now like, I'd be happy having a job. So we're being discipled by the environment at this point in time into actually a more realistic view of the world, how most humans have always lived. And most humans throughout history have always been religious because they don't have this mythological ideology around the world is a fantasy playground for you to live in and live your life goals.
That's good. When I was going back through Reappearing Church, the beginning of the second chapter, I shared this in a message with our students. I mean, this was published in 2019, and you said, if we endure a global flu pandemic like the one in the early part of the 20th century that killed millions of people across the world, how we view and process our personal potentials and possibilities would be deeply shaken. I mean, is that what we're seeing? Just the shaken reality of our personal potentials and possibilities? And is that a good thing for the church to have to go through?
I think we are, and I think we that's part of that ideology falling down. And part of that thought was I was at Dubai Airport, and Dubai Airport's really the hub of the world. It's incredible. Like you stand there and you're like waiting for your plane, and there's people from every single part of the world. And I remember thinking to myself, man, this is globalization and world power at its absolute height. Dubai is this insane, crazy city that only never would be built at another time of history apart from now. And I remember just thinking, man, all it would take is one virus to get in this terminal, and it would go within 14 hours to every part of the world. And I remember thinking, like I flew into Dubai and like, wow, this is crazy. Like, man, look at the world, how technologically advanced it is. But then I just began to think about like, because there's the biggest tower in the world in Dubai. I looked at that as I flew in, and I thought one tiny, tiny little, germ could pull all this down, and that's happened. And so I think we are in the process of having that. I think individualism is inverting at this point in time. We're moving from an individualism of expansion to an individualism of protection. And so a lot of our language now has moved from, hey, live your best life, like the early 2000s. You look back and watch TV shows then, like people just don't care. They're saying anything, like it was the rise of the Queen of America, the Princess of America at that time, Paris Hilton. And, you've got this sense now where there's this deep fear that in around us that things could turn on us. So that it's moved to this protective thing. So I think we're in process of individualism radically changing at this point in time. We haven't returned to collectivism. That is slightly happening, I think, in some ways. But I think, yeah, it's still in process, but we're going to see that radically change over the next few years.
And as we look back at those changes, what do you think is going to stand out the most that we're going to see? Like, I was reflecting the other day. I remember one day on my way to Regent College, waiting for my ride in the morning. My Australian professor, Rick Watts, was supposed to come and pick me up in my driveway. And all of a sudden I saw fighter jets escorting 747s into Vancouver airport. And I ran inside to figure out what was going on, if the world was ending, and it was 9/11. And the world was changing. And I look back and we can assess what changed in that moment. So for Gen Z growing up now, as they're going to look back on these moments, what do you think the biggest takeaways are going to be? What are the memories that are going to just be indelible and are going to change them permanently?
I think of my daughter who is 13, and yeah, I remember I flew into New Zealand on September 11th. Remember clearly flying to New Zealand, virtually no security. We actually got stuck there for a little bit. We couldn't get back, and then flying out and like getting patted down by the New Zealand military. It was like entered one world, left another. At the beginning of the pandemic with my daughter, went to the supermarket, and it was like when everyone's panic buying. It was like those first couple of weeks and just the world's panicking, and like there was empty supermarket shelves. And, I was looking at my daughter, I'm like, man, this is going to be an indelible mark in your early memory. And I think part of what she'll take from that is the world is not safe. And, that I think, whereas probably I look back and go, man, I never grew up thinking I'd go to a supermarket and the shelves would be empty. And, I feel that there's also going to be I think part of what is happening now, it's not that there's the one thing, it's not that it's the pandemic. If people look back at 2020, particularly in the United States, you don't just think of the pandemic, you think of George Floyd, you think of the election, you think of the Capitol riot. It's not one thing. So it's like someone might get one illness that's medium level, but then I've met people who've had multiple medium level illnesses at the same time that then build into a huge assault on their physical system. I think that's something similar that's happening now. And, I think there's other challenges to come. I think, a rising China, which is outlined that it's going to take Taiwan in the next 10 years. The US head of the head of the Navy is saying that's being brought forward to possibly 2027. That's intense. Now, it's not me saying that's definitely going to happen, but the threat matrix on multiple things. In Australia, just before the pandemic, there were people wearing masks in Melbourne before the pandemic because we had just the most unbelievable forest fires. like millions of hectares, millions of animals die, where we were engulfed in smoke, because of global warming. There are multiple different things. Now, I'm not saying this and predicting, hey, we're going to enter into, like zombie, land here. Because I think too, particularly in the American context, sometimes this thinking then turns into apocalyptic thinking, like in terms of like there's a secular apocalypse, like wow, it's the Walking Dead, let's go and create a compound at our house sort of thinking. Then there's the spiritual sort of apocalyptic thinking as well, and there's a weird relationship between the two. But I'm more saying that in terms of a predictable world, the American century was based on let's make the world safe, let's control it, and then we can strategically plan in a linear fashion. We're entering into a world which is much more chaotic, much more unpredictable. The good news in that is that it's going to create more resilient disciples. Where the environment, there's a term that's used in some sort of military strategy called a fitness environment, that the best trainer of troops is actually the ground and the battlefield. The Gurkhas, I was on a plane flying from, where was I? I think I was flying from Malaysia to London. And I was on a plane with the Gurkhas, who are the crack British troops, but they're actually from Nepal. And part of the reason they're such great troops is, the British always use them for all their, it's like Britain's special forces, really, is because they live in this incredible mountainous terrain. And I read this quote which said, the Gurkhas are so good because they live in one of the harshest terrains in the world and have learnt to fight in it. So there's a sense where I think that what God is going to do in the next generation is everyone going to become a resilient disciple? No. But God is going to create resilient disciples through this environment, which is not the lies that we've been told, that the world is an amusement park for you to live your dreams. That has just been teared down. So we're now going to how do I live my faith in the midst of this? And look, there could be periods of comfortability. I don't know, but I think that there is something positive that's going to emerge through. This is a refining moment. Refining moments lead to resilient disciples. A collection of resilient disciples becomes a remnant, and remnants lead to renewals.
So for all of our students who are going to engage with this, watch this, and latch onto that word, and be like, I want to be a resilient disciple. What are the characteristics of that? What are the things that they should be thinking about in their own faith formation and the practices that they're engaging in, that's going to help create that spiritual fitness to be able to be that for the world?
Yeah. One thing I've really noticed is it's interesting, I'm big on practices. And one thing I noticed that when practices, though, are defined by the environment as well. So many people I know had this great spiritual practices and it got it in sync and been discipling people at church. And then the pandemic hits and they're like, how do I do Sabbath when I'm stuck in a house with my housemates and I can't even get a minute to myself and we're all driving each other crazy? There's an element practices are still linked to the environment. So I still believe in practices, but before practices becomes a posture. If your posture's right, you then can adapt your practices for the moment. I had me and my wife had twins, or my wife gave birth to twins, and during that time, honestly, it was crazy. I had 1.5 to 3 hours sleep, 12 weeks. It was just bonkers. And during that time, I'm like, God, how do you want me to press into you? And literally, I don't know if this is crude, but I was literally in the bathroom. When I was in the bathroom, reading the Bible on my phone was the only time I had to myself, often with my daughter, who was 3, knocking on the door. And I'm like, God, how do I grow? And I felt like God say to me, Mark, you're still obeying. 5 minutes is all you've got, but you're still giving that to me. You're the widow with the 2 cents in the offering at that point in time. So posture. I had the right posture. And I felt God bring me into the right posture. So the posture I would say at this point in time is be vertically defined, not horizontally defined. Some of the biggest influences, particularly in young adults and students who will be listening here, is peers and the public pressure. And I think part of what comes from a resilient remnant is the earth does not have the answers. Heaven has the answers. We are called to be God's living priesthood in the world. Priests were called to be mediators between heaven and earth, and priests were called to step in between the people and God and actually be these mediators of God reflectors in the world. So you can only be a God reflector in the world, whatever you do in your career, in your relationships, if you're connected vertically to heaven. The great problem is that you cannot be a resilient disciple, because if you're just horizontal, if your primary connection is horizontal, not vertical, you're going to be defined by the horizontal, by the world. We still are always going to be horizontally connected because we're embedded creatures in the world, relationally connected. But our primary connection as God's living temple in the world needs to be with God. So I think once you've got that posture right, and what that means is you're going to be unpopular. If you're a young adult going to this world and thinking you can, one of the great things I feel like we did a disservice to previous generations is to communicate that you could have some form of Christianity which still makes you cool. You can have a form of Christianity where you can go into certain fields and people go, "Oh, you're Christian, but you're cool." That is gone. That is gone. You're going to be unpopular. You may go into different careers where, like, you've got to be ready for the ejector seat. Just that I'm out, and hold things lightly, because ultimately God's going to reward those who are obedient and who set their North Star to Him. I think that's the posture. Out of that, then there's a bunch of practices. So I need to read Scripture. I need to have a time with the Scriptures as defining me, and even a balance. A really confronting thing is when you look at your phone and look at your screen time. What's the comparison between the time you're spending your screen time to what you're spending in the Word? The time you're spending your screen time, the time that you're praying and worshiping. And I don't want to get religious about that, but connection to Word, connection to God speaking to you and listening to Him and being prayerful and spending time intimately with Him is just what He wants. He just wants to be with His children. Being part of a Christian community that is enabling you to do that together, and as part of a discipleship web, regular church attendance is part of that. And I'm not just saying go to a church that is the most comfortable. Go to a church that grows you is really key. Now, they may at the moment, church looks different for many of us in different parts of the world. So the practice has actually changed. It may be online for some people listening. But at this point in time, the key thing is that I think that vertical posture to then minister horizontal is key.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So a resource like the Vertical Self would be something that the students should be reading. Here, shameless plug opportunity.
Yes.
There's a lot of changes then within the church that are happening in this time as a result of this. One of them that we're seeing all around us is this move to a post-denominational era. Is it a positive thing from your viewpoint? Is that going to assist the church? Is it an act of desperation? You share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've had the chance to speak in a lot of settings, and I've spoken in everything from house churches, Baptists, Pentecostals, Charismatics, Methodists, everywhere, big, small, contemporary, traditional, charismatic Catholics, like multiple different groups, and during this cultural moment, it was fascinating in the sense that all of a sudden there's all these people who reached out. I'm like, wow, you guys are listening. This is crazy. And what I did notice is across all of that, part of me is I'm not a denominational head. I know some. I'm not envious of their job. And I feel like what I'm interested in is that I see a commonality amongst the remnant and resilient that is growing in all of those different environments. I find people in all those different spaces who at the moment God is calling people out to devote themselves to Him. I just want to clarify that. I'm not saying calling out of a denomination, but it's calling out of their usual mode of life and asking to press into Him in a new way. So in a sense, I'm less concerned about denominations. I'm less concerned about denominationalism. I'm less concerned about post-denominationalism. I'm concerned about wherever you are placed, and we're all placed somewhere. And that might be a highly liturgical church. It might be a post-denominational church. I don't know. But God is doing something in the world where He's calling that remnant out. So I think I'm more interested in that. Yeah.
Is that kind of what's meant by, and maybe I'm seeing this, in our students and in this generation, people are searching for a church, it seems like to me, or a body of believers who are on mission together, and what they actually believe, their shared doctrine, like the doctrinal stance of that denomination seems almost irrelevant to them. is that a bad thing, or is it okay to be I think yeah, some familiar words. I just don't want to be with people who believe what I believe. I want to be around people who want what I want. I
Mm,
remember hearing that. And is
mm,
that the longing, and is that a good thing for them
mm,
to want to replicate in their search
mm.
of meaningful participation in church?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess a couple of things. Like one is I feel like there is this um, a really good thing about around people who want what I want. And that is you want people who have the passion to push into God that you want. Sometimes you're going to want to be around people who want what you don't want. Um, at the like I'm going to say like social justice is a big thing in the church. You know, like at this point in time, when I was with the Salvation Army, I pushed in like I was doing this. I was literally like at times serving heroin addicts in a back alley. I didn't want to do it. I hated it. It's not wasn't fun. I took no kudos from that. It's really weird now. Like I'm a senior pastor. I'm speaking about culture, but God had me doing stuff for 10 years I didn't want to do. And he got me to go. I could live this very like, you know, I'm in this life now where I get to be in this church. I'm a senior pastor, and I get to speak around the place. But I'm indelibly marked by doing church with homeless people. And it's not, you know, there's people like, oh, doing church with like I understand now, like I took no kudos from it. It actually was far more difficult. I know people who do it and love it and they're called to it, but God did that to me because I didn't want to do that at the time. And my natural tendency was like to not think in that way. And I was around people who constantly challenged me, like Mark, remember the poor. And I'm like, okay, like it was not my bent. If I'd gone to a church who just wanted what I wanted, I would end up with a kind of Mark Sayers friendly church. I don't want church to be Mark Sayers friendly all the time because I need people to challenge me because I'm a fallen creature, and I'm gonna sometimes want stuff that's sinful, and it may not be like I want this sinful thing. It may be I just want to ignore that. And so yes, we do need people who want to press into renewal. Don't just go to church that wants what you want. Go to church that's also going to push you into being a better disciple at times. There is also a danger because, particularly with young adults, it's been so peer driven and please your peers that sometimes when you press into God, it's going to actually create social distance between you and your peers. And you can be in a situation where you're at college and you're all with your mates and it's all looking great, and then God does something in you and God calls you to a high level of like purity or holiness. And there's that crazy moment where you're talking to your friend you've been friends with 3 years, and you're like, man, she's not growing, he's not growing, and you love them, and it's not like you're going to try and do this, but you realize, and then this person who you actually thought was a bit of a turnip when you first met them, and then you see God like working in them, and then you're like, man, how's this working? I've got more kingdom connection with this person, and at the beginning I never thought I'd be friends with them. And that's the people of God being knit together. Last on just on the doctrinal thing, you know, Melbourne went through, I think, somewhat what is happening in the States a little bit now, probably 15 years ago. And maybe because I guess post-Christianity is more established here. It is different, but it's more established here. A smaller church that people began to deconstruct stuff. And there was almost this thing, well, let's have this very, very loose, almost ill-defined doctrinal status and be more connected to like, come as you are, we're just going to connect. It ended really badly. and you know, I have some scars, and I have friends who have scars, and I have friends who don't have faith anymore, who I was on mission with. And so I'm not a believer in like banging people over the head in a sense with doctrine and go back. But I believe that you need a defined orthodox doctrine, and actually people are going to start to look to that because they actually want to find a safe place. And what I notice is that the trajectory of the culture is that if you're in a Western culture, particularly sort of like the place where America is at the moment, you need a defined, you know, orthodox doctrinal state. And it may not be huge, it may just be, you know, like this is what it is, but it's going to stop you from the cultural pressure to go to extremes of left or right or other extremes or define it as you want. So there's going to be all these buttress, like all these winds coming against you of radical individualism, of, you know, too far to the left, too far to the right, nationalism, some sort of utopian globalism, whatever it may be. actually, I believe that doctrine serves us and keeps us connected to those people of God. So that would be my very long answer to that question.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I've noticed in the last number of years, I've got some close connections with churches in West Africa, and I'm realizing that the bulk of my learning is happening from these voices in other places where the gospel's like red hot, and all kinds of crazy renewal is happening, and it's tip of the spear type stuff. And every time I'm there, I feel like I'm flipping the pages in the book of Acts and like walking and living this out, and it's so invigorating. Where are you looking and seeing in the world right now that really is the places where we should be looking in terms of, I see God moving here in just ridiculous ways that's setting a tone, and this is where the heart of the church is.
Great question, like, and I'm just going to preface it, and this is maybe a slightly hard thing for people to hear, but I think we've got to mark it. Why in the pandemic have countries like Vietnam and Rwanda outperformed the United States and Great Britain? There are countries in the world now looking at the West who they always look to and like, man, you guys are ahead of us. It's almost this paternal thing, who are now like, man, we've actually got a sense of confidence, who went into this far less resourced. There was a map early on. There's this Twitter account, which is actually reposting everything about Corona from 1 year ago. And it's fascinating, like watching it. And there was this one thing it had from like a year ago, like these countries are going to perform the best. And they just basically said it's the OECD highest income countries that are going to perform the best. It hasn't worked out that way. Like it's amazing what has happened. And in some ways, and I say this with real gravity, there's been a humbling, particularly for the two countries which have dominated the last 200 years, the US and Great Britain. I think there is something happening in the world. Just in the, mentioned early on, the Resilient Disciples, which comes out of the Barna study, and there's Faith for Exiles, book by my friend David Kinnaman and Matt Locke, a really fantastic resource. Can't recommend it highly enough. I substituted in for Dave when he's unable to make the Asia leg of that trip. And I got to go to Malaysia, who has some of the highest Resilient Disciples in the world. Also Kenya as well. So, Kenya and Malaysia should be looking at this country. So I go and, I want to know what's going on there. In Malaysia, it's a minority Christian population and a dominant Islamic Christian population. Now, it's not straight up, all out persecution. There have been some people who have reached out to the Malay. So basically the law is that a Sikh can convert to Christian, or a Christian can convert to Jew, or a Buddhist can convert to Hindu, but no one can convert a Muslim. And so, there is pressure there. There are people who will come and check their services that's not happening. There's people who have reached out to the Muslim community have disappeared. So they know there is this pressure. They're a minority. And they actually have some of the highest Resilient Disciples in the world, because it's for real. I saw footage from Kenya when I haven't had a chance to visit Kenya, but I remember remembering, and when coronavirus hit, these incredible scenes of people in Nairobi, my friend sent me, just all across the city kneeling and praying that the pandemic will not hit the country. And, I see this stuff and go, I just want to learn. And I feel like there's a really important diversity conversation happening at the moment. And, what that partially looks like, let's listen to people from these various ethnicities, and let's have more racial equity. There's also a global equity and a global diversity, because part of the problem is that our answers often will be, we see this problem with diversity, so we're going to have a Western answer to that. And sometimes that even includes minorities within the West who don't realize that they still sometimes can even think in a Western way. And I had just this incredible, at the beginning of the pandemic, just a couple months where I just was able to speak to multiple groups from across the world. And I began to see God doing stuff in India as I talked to Christians there, with the citizenship bill, as the country's moving more towards a Hindu identity. I think God's doing things in the church in China. I think West Africa, there's things happening in Asia. There's a second moment in South America. I was talking to a friend who has a ministry to Asian diaspora, and what God's doing amongst Japanese and like I think Taiwanese people in like Brazil, incredible stuff. The Persians I mentioned before, there is a Persian revival across the world in Afghanistan and Iran. So I believe there's actually this incredible global moment that we can listen to. But in the West, we have to have humbleness and realize that we've lost a lot of moral authority. And that's everyone in those Western countries. And now it's time to listen. Just a final comment. I was talking to some Asian American leaders yesterday, and and I was talking to them. They'd always felt like, with what's been happening in the US lately, and just processing that. And I said to them, guys, you realize that actually you're a bridge to the future? Like, what? And I said that we're moving from the American century into the Asian century. Asia has hugely outperformed the West in pandemic. Asia now Singapore looks more futuristic than any American city. Tokyo, Seoul, it looks like the future. These cities increasingly have really good, all these countries increasingly have like healthy political science compared to the West, like in terms of you have the political science markers. And in a sense, we're moving to an Asian century. So what can we learn? What can we learn from how people pray in Singapore? What the Korean church did, when it faced cultural crisis? What has the underground church in China done during a period of tremendous persecution? So I think that there is stuff happening across the world. I think the onus on us is to realize that we've got a lot to learn and we need to be better listeners. One really interesting thing that's going to happen perhaps in the next 5 years is that there'll probably be universal language on social media, which is going to be a game changer. So it'll translate. So someone who's writing in Mandarin, it'll translate into, we'll see everything in English. And I think that's going to be a fascinating moment for the church. When I think because the language barrier is going to be eradicated a little bit, like an anti-Babel moment, and all of a sudden the conversation of the church might become less Western centric and it's still primarily US centric. And I think that's going to be a really interesting moment for the church.
It's a fantastic thought of what it would be like to be able to connect at that level and learn. Like I've noticed even on our campus, we've seen such a revitalization in prayer when more Korean students came, and these pieces that have been so beautiful that God has preserved in different corners of the world, that we've had an anemic version of faith without them. But how do we deconstruct our own pride to be excited to receive that? Because if you keep telling, right, like in our setting, if we keep telling each other, we're not going to be the global superpower anymore, or maybe just for economically for a little while longer, but spiritually that's elsewhere. It's hard for people to hear. I think we've often thought of missions. We've thought of our engagement in terms of charity. It's just it's very condescending. So that's a big move to go to a place of humility and receptivity and watch on a global scale getting played out. The Beatitudes, like blessed are those who are in a place to actually receive the gospel because they're not so arrogant as to be hard-hearted towards it. But how do we do that? How do we preach into that in the West right now?
Yeah. I think it's honestly, and this sounds very Old Testament. Yeah, humble yourself or you'll be humbled. And, I think that there is a humbling happening. And particularly in the US, you look at this humbling moment that continues to happen. Whilst that's very Old Testament, we also see that, the Hesed, the loving kindness of God. And, I actually think that God loves the humble. Like I feel at this moment, what I keep saying to people is he's looking for the holy, the hungry, the humble. And, there's this sense where there is this individual pushing into that. Cultures are really complex. Like I thought about this yesterday, and I thought I saw a plane flying over and like a big jet, and I'm like, man, it must be hard to fly that thing. Like fly from like Sydney to the Middle East. Like people do this. Like how do they do this? It's crazy. With hundreds of people and protect them. And then I thought, you know what? It's probably would be easier for you and I to learn how to fly one of those jets than to actually understand all the intricacies of culture. Cultures are so complex. We have this ridiculous thing that it's this monocausal thing with culture. There's so many things happening in culture. Like people often say to me, is it Should we be looking at more of the race thing or the class thing? People don't talk about class, or is it economics? What is it? I'm like, man, it's everything. It is everything. Like culture is everything. And so I feel like there's this sense where, yes, we need to engage with culture, but there needs to be a personal humbling. So I would say start with your own humbling. We see that pattern of renewal throughout the Old Testament all the time. You know, I think I was reading Ezekiel yesterday. I think maybe around chapter 10, and he's talking about like, how do we sort of like cleanse the temple after the presence has left the temple? It's, you know, get rid of the idols, you know, humble yourself before God. And, you know, I feel like there's a humbling before God, which needs to happen. And I think the remnant presses into that first. And sometimes the remnant presses into that first on behalf of the nation, so that the humbling of the nation is not as extreme, you know, as it could be. So I think a sort of intercession moment is happening, but also to the, again, just to reinforce the opportunity of this time. It's hard, but there is this, you know, George Hunter talked about the gap between idols, that in missions, look for the people who are between idols. There are so many people who come to faith moving to a new country because they're just open. You know, Ryan, who's on our staff here, one of the pastoral team, was just talking to him the other day. He's from the UK, far from God. When he comes from the UK, comes the GFC hits, comes out here for a building project, doesn't know anyone, brings a suitcase. And he says that moment was all of a sudden his whole life was up for rethinking. Does an Alpha course, comes to faith. That would not have happened if he'd stayed in London. So there's this moment where that's happening for us. This understanding of how people in the West understood themselves is changing. The idols are falling, and it's like we're in a subway when you're like, it's light, and there's obviously a missing bit in the like the electric, and it goes dark, and you sort of panic, but you know that it's gonna come back on. Everyone sort of goes silent, and then the light comes back on. Like, phew, we're in one of those like gaps where it's gone dark in the subway car, but the light will come back on. But that moment when it goes dark is actually an opportunity for the gospel, because we're in between idols. So I think a humbleness in us and soft hearts will actually create a humbleness and soft hearts in others, or we'll find the ones who are humble and looking for something, looking for good news at this time.
It's a good word. Thank you. I want to be respectful of your time. One more question?
Yeah. Go for it.
All right. If you were leading a Christian university in the United States right now, what would be the key places you'd want to emphasize your time and attention on in order to make sure that this generation is everything that the world is going to need it to be?
Yeah. A couple of things. The first thing I would emphasize is creating a fantastic spiritual culture. First of all, of worship, of personal faith that's alive, would be number one. And that there would be spaces and places for those who want to press into God for that. The second thing is that what's really interesting is we're in this incredibly fluid moment. One of the ways I'm thinking about the culture at the moment is it's a gray zone. So it's like, we know that a previous era is ending and one's beginning, but we're not like, it's not like the previous era ended, you know, I don't know, on January 2020 and on February, the new one began. We're actually in this gray zone between. One of my favorite movies is The Third Man, with Orson Welles. And it's this really weird, it's like the World War II's ended, they're in Vienna, but the new world hasn't begun. Like the World War II's ending, the Cold War hasn't begun yet. And they're in this really weird in-between space. And like there's this bit where Orson Welles is like the bad guy and you're trying to get him, but he's an American. And the Viennese like army, which are wearing the German Nazi helmets, are chasing him, and you're like wanting the guys with the Nazi helmets to get and like part of this is the director playing with, well, who's good and who's bad now, and even all the angles, it's like this gray zone, and there's all these like gray zones in Vienna as it's divided up, and I feel like that's where we're at now. So like, that makes it really difficult with curriculum development, because what's going to happen is once you write a curriculum for an issue, the issue could be gone. I said to someone recently, probably, I was talking to some pastors, said, probably in 2 years, you're going to be apologizing for something you're ignoring now and you don't know what it is. You know, so like there's an element, we've seen that with racial justice, where people are like, well, man, we didn't talk about this enough. We didn't address this. Well, maybe in 2 years, it's going to be like, we are so sorry we didn't. And they're like, global warming is absolutely causing catastrophic effects. We did not talk about it as a church. Yeah. Or it could be some issue we're not even seeing. And so how do you do when there's this rapid news cycle? So it's sort of like, you know, Me Too and there's racial justice and there's like So this is like happening at breakneck speed, and the internet makes that faster. And the internet also goes around institutions. So a Christian university is an institution, and like the internet allows it to go around all the time and go around the institution. That's happening in politics now. So I would actually teach people how to see the world is really key. Giving them biblical eyes, but then also a sense to culturally deconstruct in a healthy sense. There is a great cultural deconstruction happening. And in a sense, what the biblical, I think, story does also has its own form of cultural deconstruction, which takes down idols. So I think the next generation is going to just be, the setting is not an institutional building setting. It's actually going to be an idol exposing setting. And unless you teach people how to do that from a biblical sense, they're going to do it from a secular sense of multiple different political platforms. But then also we need to teach people also how to build stuff that lasts, because the energy of this age that we're in at the moment is a tearing down energy, and some of that needs to happen. But the alacrity to know when to build and when to tear down is really key. That sounds really cool. And I'm not a university leader, and the people like, that sounds great. How on earth do you do that, Mark? I don't know. In the practical, I'm not called to that. Thank you. Thank you, God.
Well, for what you are called to, Mark, you're being fantastically faithful at, and you are blessing a ton of people, including us. Thanks for taking this time to be with us. I'm gonna spend some time in prayer tonight, just giving thanks to God for what I've learned through your voice, and I'm hoping more people are sharing that same opportunity. Thanks for doing what you're doing. Keep leading well, and yeah, it was an absolute delight to spend some time with you. And I know our students and beyond are going to be blessed by this. So
My
grateful.
pleasure. It's been so good. My pleasure.
Thanks, Mark.